Snagging your lure is one of the most frustrating parts of fishing, and it's somehow inevitable. But tackle ain't cheap, so we're going to talk about how to minimize snagging and get the highest percentage of them back on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to us, as always, by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com or ship direct to store at any one of 140 plus stores nationwide. I was in Sportsman's last night, got to talk to a few people, picked up a few tackle, fixing to head out of town. Pretty excited about it. Why did I have to pick up some tackle? Because I lost some stuff to snags. And a few of you have asked me recently on the Facebook page, on the Fishful Thinker Facebook page, about snagging. And after 20 years of guiding and seeing how people snag and how much they snag, at tournament level fishing where snagging and losing something, particularly if it's the only thing you have, can be a problem, and just teaching lots of kids through the junior Bassmasters all the way up through high school and kids mentoring, all of those kinds of things. I've had more than my share of time dealing with snags. And the particular lake that I live on and that I've guided on, or one of the lakes I've guided on for many years, 20 years, is very, very rocky. I mean, very rocky. Like, the only real cover in the lake most of the time is rock. Other than the occasional fallen cottonwood tree or something like that, most of the time you're fishing rock. And a lot of that rock is very snaggy rock. It's not small little gravel or something like that. It's basically big pieces of sandstone that were quarried heavily for many years, and now the lake was flooded, and it's a lot of snaggy rock. And so I also live here in the western United States, and I travel around and fish a lot, and I fish rock dams a lot. Very, very snaggy. My favorite species to target in freshwater is for sure bass, and bass, particularly largemouth bass, love wood cover of all kinds, can be snaggy. Oh, maybe they're in the willow bushes, also snaggy. Even trout in the river. You know, I work a lot of hard plugs and jigs in the river. Well, then you have current pushing against your lure, also going to increase your snagging percentage. So, as I said in the open here, it's part of fishing. And I want to throw one thing out really quick. If you've got a lure that you're afraid to lose, you're not going to catch as many fish with it. So I see guys that say, well, I'm not going to throw this jerkbait around this standing timber because I could snag and lose it, and it's my favorite jerkbait. So then they get their less favorite jerkbait out and start throwing it, but then they're not fishing with confidence. And confidence catches more fish than any fancy lure. So right off the bat, I'm going to say, if you're truly afraid to lose something, be it for cost or sentimental value or something like that, you need to reconsider a little bit using it at all, because again, you need to be able to throw it with confidence wherever you need to be able to throw it, and that's a really important thing. So I want to start off with that. Second of all, nobody can avoid all the snags. It's just is what it is. If you're not fishing around cover for so many different species of fish, or fishing around rock, or whatever the case might be, you're probably not going to catch as many fish. And particularly for guys that are a little bit novice, and I deal with a lot of novice guys because my house literally backs to the lake. So I see all kinds of guys walking the bank fishing all the time, and I will very commonly walk down and talk to guys and see what they're up to. And a lot of them have kids or wives that maybe don't fish as much, or whatever the case might be. But what I notice so much is people are fishing high in the water column all the time. And that's fine if the fish are high in the water column. You have much less chance of snagging, that's without question. But you also have much less chance of catching fish in a lot of cases. So I figured I should address some ways that will help you minimize snagging, and then also ways to get everything back, or as much of it back as you can. And first thing I'm going to say is get a plug retriever if you're really worried about it. And there's a couple different versions of plug retrievers that you can use. My favorite one, and the one that I use day in and day out and literally stays on the deck of my boat on guide trips all through the spring when we're fishing banks all through the spring of the year, the plug retrievers plug retriever stays on the deck of my boat. And the reason it does is because I'll have guys that throw and snag in the rocks themselves around the edges of the lake. They'll throw them commonly up in the trees, which ironically we catch a lot of fish every year, but almost all of them are in the lake. And I cannot convince guys not to throw their lures in the trees trying to catch them. But unfortunately, it's part of it. And that's why I preach casting accuracy and line control so much, because either they just throw the lure in the tree or they let the wind blow a big bow in the line, which then catches tree limbs or branches or whatever the case might be. And again, we have the snagging issue. So a plug retriever is very important. And the kind I use is made by Fraybill, and it extends to 18 feet. I think it's 18 feet. Been using it for many, many years, and it's basically like a golf ball retriever. If you've ever seen, golf ball retriever for in the water, it extends out, and instead of having a little cup to grab the ball, it's got a spring on the end of it that like a corkscrew, and you just wind that on your line, and then you can reach out and get the treble hooks or whatever the case might be, or use it to poke the lure free as the case might be. And it's rigid, and that's what I like about it, because I can reach up in the tree or I can reach out on the bank. So if you throw your lure, a foot and a half up on the bank, well, it doesn't make sense to destroy a trolling motor prop trying to get your boat close enough when I can stay out off the bank just a little bit and extend my plug retriever and reach out and get it back. So that's first and foremost. The other type that you can use in case they're very deep, your lures are very deep, is a piece of cords. I've seen guys put it on like 100-pound braid. But at any rate, wind it on a reel, and it's got a weighted retriever on it that, again, you hook on the line and you send the weight down, and that works okay. It works good for deep crankbaits, like when you're cranking 15, 18 feet, something like that. It works pretty good for that. Also will work for deep jigs, and so I carry both of those in the boat. But to be honest with you, the rigid Fraybill plug retriever gets 99% of the use. So if you're going to get one, get one of those. The other thing I'm going to throw out there is, and somebody can say, "Oh, that's expensive. I could buy lures." Yeah, but on guide trips during the spring, I will usually use mine a couple of times a day. And like I said, lures aren't cheap. So if you're going to use that thing very much, it will pay for itself very quickly. And mine is many years old at this point, so it's paid for itself probably 10 times over. But the other thing I'll throw out is, even if you're a bank fisherman, it can be very handy, because a lot of the times your snags, particularly if you're fishing strictly lures, are going to be as your bait gets close to the bank, because you're fishing up the hill, so to speak. The water farther out from you is typically deeper than obviously the bank you're standing on. And so a lot of your snags will be within 18 feet of the bank. So you can reach out and poke some of them off with that as well. Particularly, I carry that when I'm night fishing. If I'm going night fishing for walleyes, which I'm well known to do, go walk rock banks for walleyes at night. Well, most of your snags are going to be right off the shore, and you can't see, so you're going to have a higher snagging percentage. So that thing will help you out a whole bunch. So get a plug retriever. If you're a boat guy, a walleye guy, bass guy, whatever, and you're in the boat all the time, for sure get one of each. Neither of them are that expensive, and they're worth having. So I'll throw that little detail out there right off the bat. And then from there, that's the easiest way to get them back. From there, there's a few other things that are important to help you minimize snagging. The first one I'm going to throw out there, and this sounds dumb, but I'm going to say it anyway. The best quality polarized glasses that you can get, particularly for guys that fish banks a lot, be from the boat or the other way around, from the bank. Because what you need to see is those flooded bushes you can't see, or that sunken log right there, those individual rocks that you didn't see because you didn't have good polarized glasses on, like high quality polarized glasses on, and you threw your stuff right up in it and got it snagged. So I do that a lot. And this spring and last spring, I've been doing a ton of bank fishing, like every single day, even if it's only for 5 minutes a day. And I'm almost relearning how important my polarized glasses are, because I don't have a depth finder. I don't have any of those things that I would have in the boat. But what I do have is a really good pair of Costa sunglasses in the correct lens colors, and I pay attention to what's off the bank in front of me as far out as I can see. The clearer the water, the more important those become. So that's a thing that you probably want to keep in mind. They'll also help you detect more bites by watching your line. So again, something that will help you a lot. So let's start from the bank, because I know a higher percentage of you bank fish than boat fish. How are we going to minimize our snags? first and foremost, I feel like a broken record, but I'm going to say it. Line control. If we're talking about a jig or a Texas rig or any sort of bottom contact bait, a tube jig, a finesse jig of any kind, a jig and pig, anything like that that's going to be tight on the bottom, the biggest thing you can do is manage your line control. And line control is a combination of how much slack you have, what position your rod is in, and how much resistance your lure has in the water. So right off the bat, the first thing I'm going to say, you're going to get fewer snags retrieving a bait, particularly as it gets closer to the bank, with the rod tip high. And what that does is it gives you a steeper angle of pull on your bait. So if you watch videos of me jigging, per se, from the bank, and there's a whole bunch of them out there on our social media and YouTube, whatever, my rod tip is very high all the time, because as soon as you get the rod tip low, you flatten that line angle out. It makes it harder to see the line, for one, and it makes you want to pull the bait more horizontal, for two. So the only time you'll see me on the bank with the rod tip down low is when the bait's well out over open water, and usually it's going to be something I'm retrieving. So a crankbait, a jerk bait, something like that. And then as it gets closer to the bank, I will transition that rod tip from being down close to the water all the way up to pointing 45 degrees out and up in front of me. And that again changes that line angle, will help you work the bait up the hill. When it comes to a bottom contact bait, this is big. When it comes to a bottom contact bait, I want a controlled bow in the line all the time, meaning that from the rod tip to where the line's going in the water, I can see a bow in the line. There's not slack line laying on the water that's just laying on the surface, nor is the line tight, because in most scenarios, if the line's tight enough to not have a bow in it, your bait's nowhere near the bottom, it's coming towards you, and that in a lot of cases won't get you a number of bites. So if I'm gonna work a tube jig or a power switch or a gulp minnow or anything like that, I'm going to really pay attention to that rod angle and keep it high. And if I'm working something like a jerk bait or a crankbait back, then I'll keep it tipped down until it gets to me, and then I'll start working it up from there. As the bait gets closer, I'll start working it up from there. The bottom contact bait with the bow in the line, I'm always watching as far out on that line as I can see. Excuse me, that's where my eyes are focused all the time. I'm looking as far out there as I can at the line on the surface of the water, because I'm a big believer in line watching. If you slack the bait all the way out, let's just pick a random one and say a tube jig, because tube jigs work for basically everything and a lot of people fish them. Let's say you got a tube jig. If I slack it all the way out, just give it slack to where there's a point where there's line on the surface of the water and there's zero tension between me and the bait, it's going to sink into whatever is out there, and I'm going to have no idea what it is. And in the case of my lake, with all the rock, you're probably never going to see it again, because it's going to drop straight into some crevice between all the rock, and that's going to be into that thing. So the controlled slack is important, but same thing, like I said with the tube jig, if I try to keep the line tight, the bait really never even gets to the bottom. And that's not ideal either, because a lot of the time the fish are going to be relatively tight to the bottom, or they're going to get it on the drop. So that controlled bow is the first thing that will help you all the time. And that's a matter of how much time you spend on the reel versus the position of the rod versus how heavy the bait is or how much resistance it has in the water. So go look up some videos on our YouTube channel about that. I've done whole videos about line control and as it relates to spinning tackle and casting tackle, either one. But that controlled bow is a big thing. It's going to help you a lot. And again, I don't want the line tight, and I don't ever want to see line just sitting on the surface of the water. Along those lines, and this was a huge pet peeve of mine guiding, and I see it all the time. A guy throws a bait out, be it from the bank or from the boat, and then lets it sink without controlling the slack coming off the reel. And so the bail's open and the thing's just sinking. Well, by the time you even realize it's at the bottom, it could have sunk into who knows what. So I want to control the slack coming off of the reel, either with my finger on the spool or my palm on the spool or my thumb on the spool, as the case would be in a bait casting reel. Or even if you're like a closed face, like a Zepco's type guy, use your your pointer finger on the hole where the line's coming out of, but control the speed so that the line comes off the reel no faster than the bait is sinking. And then as even maybe before you think it hits the bottom, but if you have some control on it, if it's close to the bottom, you're going to know right away because there's a straighter line between you and your bait. So that's important to do. Second of all, sensitive equipment. And this is a big one. I was just on the bank with a kid the other day, didn't know him, just met him, trying to teach him a couple things about some jigging because he was having some questions. Well, he had a very, let's just say, unsensitive rod, and it had significantly oversized nylon monofilament on it. Junior wasn't getting it, what I was trying to teach him. I hand him my rod, which is a much crisper, much lighter weight rod, much more sensitive rod because of the crispness in the rod. If it's boingy, let's just say, which is a very technical term for a relatively slow action rod, you're not going to feel as much. So if you're really concerned about it and you want to up your angling, particularly with bottom contact baits of any kind, get a faster action, better quality, more sensitive rod, and you do not have to spend a lot of money. You can go to a Fenwick, HMG or something like that and not spend a tremendous amount of money and have a rod that is going to significantly help you. So a sensitive rod will help a whole bunch. Now, the next thing I'm going to throw out, let me back up real quick before I go there. Also, that rod needs to be the power rating of that rod needs to be for the weight of the lures that you tend to throw with it. And that's another big one I see. So in the case of Junior the other day on the bank, the rod was okay, but the line was way too heavy for the lure that he was throwing. And I see one of those two combos a lot. I either see a heavier rod than the lure needs to be, or the line's heavy. But long story short, balanced tackle. And it sounds dumb, but it will keep a lot of management of your overall situation better all the way around. When I say management, I mean controlling your slack, casting your lure, feeling your lure. All of those things will be better with a little bit better quality rod and then appropriately sized for the lure that you're throwing. Now, I'm going to go back to where I was going to head forward here in a second, or a minute ago, and that is the next thing is line. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky because depending on the scenario, each have their advantages. So let's say you're throwing monofilament of some sort, either nylon or fluorocarbon. Both of those are not anywhere near as sensitive as braid. Fluorocarbon is somewhere in between. Nylon is the least sensitive and braid is the most sensitive. The flip side of that is that both monofilament, either nylon or fluorocarbon, have more stretch than does braid. And again, fluoro is somewhere in the middle there. Nylon's very, very stretchy, like 10 or 12 or 15% of its length type stretch, whereas fluorocarbon's more like 5% of its length, whereas braid is more like 0.01% of its length. That lack of stretch and that straight line that braid lies out there is very good for feeling where the bottom is. It also gives you tensile strength to potentially roll rocks. If your stuff is hung in the rocks, which is a big one in the river for me, with braided line tied to a jig or tied to something in the bottom, if I point the rod straight at it, grab the spool and pull gently, evenly, and slowly, and I have nice knots tied, I can a lot of times just get the rock to roll over and give me my jig back that way. Or by using a low carbon hook that is straightening,able. I can literally point the rod straight at it, and you don't ever want to put a load in the rod or bend the rod. That's a great way to break that rod you just bought. Point the rod straight at it, pull very gently and evenly, and see if you can straighten the hook. That's another way to get them back quickly. Now, there's a trick that can be really good about getting them back, and that is putting a little bit of load using your non-rod hand, in other words, your reeling hand, to pull a bunch of slack line and then popping it. And when I say popping it, it's kind of a pluck move. And what it does is it kind of sends a shockwave down the line, and you would be surprised at how many jigs will pop right out of the rocks, even 20 feet below the boat or 20 feet offshore, if you do that right. And the trick to it is the right amount of stretch in the system and the right amount of load on the rod, and then the instant release of it. And it will just allow things to pop loose right away. And that can be really important. And typically for that to work is going to be something that I probably should have mentioned right in the very beginning of this, is the worst thing you can do for a snag. As soon as you get it, the worst thing you can do is pull on it and yank on it or anything like that. As soon as I see guys doing that, I freak out right away. And I tell them in the boat, when we're jig fishing, when I'm guiding and we're going to be jig fishing, I tell everybody right away, as soon as you feel like you're snagged, the first thing I want you to do is slack the line out, because I don't want you to set the hook or pull the lead head or whatever into whatever it is. The sooner you stop pulling on it and just try to gently shake it off, the better your chances are. If you can't shake it off, then in a boat you can maybe get on top of it and shake it off. And I just mean gentle little shakes on it. See if you can get it to shake free. If you can't, that's when I'll start trying to pop it loose by putting a load in the rod, pulling on the slack line, putting a little bit of load in the rod and bouncing at it and seeing if it'll pop off that way. Typically I'll do that 3 or 4 or 5 times. If that doesn't work, then I'll point the rod straight at it and try to pull on it and get it back that way. I can tell you with pretty good confidence that I can get a very high percentage of snags back with any kind of a lure just by doing that, especially jigs, things like that. Treble hook lures can be a little bit harder because typically they're moving forward faster when they get snagged, and then that treble hook's going to grab something, and it's a little tougher to bounce that out of something like wood cover because the wood cover itself is flexible. But if it's snagged in rock, which isn't flexible, you can use that same string trick to pop it back. And I again have demonstrated that in a lot of TV shows over the years. It's hard to describe, and in fact maybe it's a video I'll put together here next time I'm out. But there are several different ways to pop the bait loose by putting a big load in the rod and then suddenly releasing that. And I know guys who do it with different techniques as far as how they hold the rod and the line, but at the end of the day, the concept is the same. You put a bunch of load on it, and then that load instantly releases when you let it go. And when that load releases, that shock wave will go down the line and pop things loose. The reason I said both nylon and nylon and fluorocarbon and braid have their strengths and weaknesses, the braid is much better for feeling snags before you're in them, but it's harder to use that popping trick to get them loose because the braid itself has no stretch. The nylon, on the other hand, is the easiest because it gets a tremendous amount of stretch. So you can put a bunch of stretch and suddenly release that stretch, and it'll pop your bait loose a lot of the time. But again, I want to reiterate the most important thing: do not pull on it. As soon as you know you're snagged, don't pull on it. When I see a guy bouncing the rod, doink, 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 yanking on it with the rod, I know right away, first of all, he's an amateur, rookie, whatever you want to call it. Second of all, whatever he's jerking on is probably not getting back in the boat or on the bank where he is. So that's really, really important that you slack him out right off the bat. So moving a little bit forward here, fishing from the bank, I will oftentimes choose lures that either don't sink as fast or don't sink at all in terms of hard baits, things like that, because as the bait's coming to me, working up the hill to the bank I'm standing on, I can at any given point stall it out and let it float slightly. And so I've done podcasts on why I throw a Berkeley hit stick from the bank but a Berkeley stunner from the boat. And the difference comes down to the fact that the hit stick rises slowly. And so as it gets closer to me, I can just give it a little bit of a pause and it will float up a little bit more, and then I'll keep working it. And then it will float up a little more, kind of like the opposite of working downstairs. It's working its way upstairs one step at a time. And that's an excellent thing. So if I'm going to do something like, say, a lipless crankbait in the wind, very common thing for me to throw from the bank or the boat, that thing I'm just not going to let it get near the bottom. That's just not the kind of bait that I want near the bottom from the bank, because I have no safety net. If it gets too deep, I have no way, even pulling my rod tip way high and really get my line angle as steep as I can, it's still very difficult to get that thing to work uphill. So the only time I'm going to throw a lipless crankbait from the bank is when I'm going to keep it up off the bottom a little bit until it's within 15 feet of the bank or so. And obviously that will keep it from snagging. Or the other thing is fish it on gravel banks, flat banks, things like that, or around vegetation, which I commonly do in ponds, because there again, let's say that thing buries in the elodia grass or hydrilla grass or whatever the grass is where you fish in ponds. Again, you can point the rod and pull, and it'll just pull the grass right out, and you'll get back with a whole giant salad stuck on your lipless crankbait, but you'll get them back. And it's just, I'll pick my bait. I guess at the end of the day, I will pick my lures from the bank, understanding their relation to the bank that I'm sitting on. So floating baits work really good from the bank. I might throw, topwater baits from the bank a lot, and I can throw them shallow. I can throw them over deeper water. Depends on what I'm doing. I'm going to go catch wipers and white bass this week. I can throw that thing out over deep water and work a topwater bait, no problem, no chance of snagging. So again, I'll pick my baits a little bit based on where I'm at. If I am gonna jig fish, then I'm typically going to fish, again, less expensive jigs with a low carbon hook so I can straighten the hook, or if I lose the jig, it doesn't matter. So if I'm paying $1 a piece for a jig head, I'm a little more gun shy with it, and the hook's likely to be more fragile. Because it's a sharper hook, the hook itself is more fragile and will likely break. If you've got a low carbon hook on a cheap jig head, you can straighten the hook. You can also sharpen that hook, but you run the risk that the hook itself isn't as sharp. So keeping track of them is important, because anytime they do contact the rocks or whatever, it's going to dull that thing immediately. And so those I will always carry a little file on the boat, and I will touch them up commonly with those less expensive jig heads. And the other thing I'll throw out along that same line, if you're really concerned about it with some of your hard baits, maybe your jerk baits, well, then upsize your hooks one size, maybe two that are on that jerk bait, but downsize the wire size. So put light wire trebles on there. And again, if it snags, you can straighten the treble hook. If you just move to light wire trebles, most likely you're going to disrupt the balance of the bait. So I have to upsize them once or twice, which may to some degree increase your ability to snag, but also increase your ability to get it back. So it's a give and take as far as that goes. Important. And then another thing I'm going to throw out, and this is a big one, if you are going to throw braid around, from the bank, one of the things I'll commonly do is eliminate the leader. And the reason is then there's no knots between me and my lure except the one tied to the lure, and there's no weak points. So the braided line with its tensile strength, if you point it straight at something, you point the rod straight at something and you pull on it, something's going to give, and most likely it's going to be a hook or something like that. So if I'm fishing, a jerkbait from the bank, I might throw it. If I'm really concerned about snagging, if the bank's flatter and there's a bunch of boulders or something like that on it, I might throw it with no leader at all, just to maintain the massive amount of tensile strength that braid has. Braid in good condition will typically break way above its rating. And I've tested that on Berkeley's Knot Machine a whole bunch. If you put a good Palomar or double Palomar on and you have good quality braid that is in good condition, it has a lot of tensile strength, and you can literally pull on stuff, again, not loading the rod, to get something else to fail. Most typically it's going to be a hook, and hook is a cheap thing to replace. So I, in fact, just spent an hour in my garage replacing hooks on a bunch of baits. I have a wounded bait box, and I threw all those in there. And then I'll go out and spend an hour and swap hooks on all the stuff that needs to be repaired, and then put it back into rotation in the boxes. But that's another thing that I think will help you out a whole bunch there. I just carry spare hooks in the boat in case it's the only bait I have, but from the bank I don't carry that kind of a volume of equipment. I carry very little, just for the record, from the bank. Typically only a few lures at a time. But that's kind of my thing on snagging. The big thing, couple key things. First of all, that bow in the line and that control of anything that sinks, and whatever bait it is that sinks, is the most important thing, period. I cannot emphasize that enough, that you learn to control that bow in your line. And the heavier the bait is, or the more resistance in the water, the flatter that bow might be. The lighter the bait is, or the less resistance in the water, the more that bow might be. But that's the most important thing. Watching really close with your glasses to see where you're throwing it, and not making a dunce move like throwing it into a submerged bush you couldn't see because of the glare on the surface. Also very important. Consider upgrading your equipment if you haven't, such that your rod is way more sensitive and crisper in action and sized correctly for what you're throwing. All things considered, I'd rather a rod that's slightly too stiff than a rod that's not stiff enough. And the reason is it gives me better feel of the lure. So that's another thing that I'd like to throw out there, but that's important. And then choose your line. If you're not going to fish around rock cover all the time, I would throw braid from the bank or from the boat. If I'm fishing around vegetation, wood cover, anything like that, I want braided line. If I'm fishing pure rock is when I will make the decision, okay, do the benefits of getting my lure back outweigh the disadvantages and lack of sensitivity and lack of tensile strength? So that's a decision you have to make based on where you fish. And then lastly, if you do have a boat, again, don't pull on them. Before I even get to lastly, don't pull on the snag. As soon as you know it's not a snag or not a fish, that it is for sure a snag, the first thing you need to do is slack the bait out and start just shaking the rod tip, trying to just jiggle it. You can try your angles a little bit, things like that. Depending on what it's hung in, you can get it back. Along those same lines from the boat, I will often circle something, particularly if it's something that is like a hump or something like that, or a rock ridge. I can get on the other side of it and pull my bait back that way. The boat gives you a definite advantage of getting a bunch of your stuff back. So just get on the other side of it. Be patient with the snag as well. And then the last one, this is kind of a fun one, and it's more lighthearted, but I'm gonna throw it out there anyway. If you happen to be drop shot fishing and you snag your sinker, which is what you're going to snag 90% of the time with a drop shot, just be patient. Just keep shaking it and be patient, because a lot of times fish will help you. I did that 3 times in a row on film last fall, where the snake snagged. Okay, just gonna be patient, just keep jiggling it, and next thing you know, my max scent flatworm gets picked up, and sometimes you still lose the sinker, sometimes not, but at least you get the fish to go with it. So that's a drop shot specific thing, but it works a lot higher percentage of the time than you think. And as a guide, when we're during drop shot season, as soon as my clients hang those sinkers, which they do a lot because clients don't manage slack line as well, which should tell you the importance of slack line management, then I'll just have them hold still and wait for the smallmouth to grab it. And usually within a minute or two, one of them will come by and grab it if you're anywhere near fish. So that's kind of my spiel. There is no way to avoid snagging. If you're so worried about snagging, whatever, then maybe a different hobby, or focus on fish that are high in the column a lot of the time in reservoirs or whatever, like trout. Very much could be anywhere in the water column, or white bass, things like that, that'll commonly feed high in the water column. So, or topwater fish, if you're going to go bass fishing for, largemouth, smallmouth bass, things like that, you can alter your lures up from there, and that will be important. So, last thing I'll throw out there for the river guys, if you're really getting snagged a bunch, work your baits upstream or 45 across the stream from down. So throw it 45 down and work it up. Way easier to keep out of the snags. If you throw up current, you're going to snag a lot more. So, and that's because the current's going to push your stuff into the leading edge of rocks, and it's going to be tough. So keep those things in mind. So, kind of a nebulous podcast all over the place, and I apologize for that. It's kind of a hard topic. It would be easier topic to demonstrate on film, and maybe we'll make a TV show about that. Hopefully we will, and it will be on our YouTube. Speaking of YouTube, at Fishful Thinker, please check that out and subscribe while you're there. That would be very important to me. It's a lot of education stuff, 650 videos, all education. So check that out, and if you've got specific things you're trying to figure out, there's a good chance we've addressed it on the YouTube channel. You can also join the conversation at Fishful Thinker on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, and also tune in to Altitude Sports Entertainment or World Fishing Network and see what we're up to on network television. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.